After you.
Okay, everyone, hello. Let me go ahead and say that I've been trying to get this gentleman to come and talk for us for a few years now. Thank goodness LinkedIn finally, that LinkedIn message finally went through. William Oldfield is the co-author of a book, Inspector Oldfield and the Black Hand Society, which is an interesting look at one of his relatives. And he was going to tell you all about it. William, the floor is yours.
All right, very good. Thank you. Thank you. First of all, to help you out on names, there's a lot of name use in my family. So my name is William Hamilton Oldfield. I descended from William and Hamilton, Hamilton being an Ellicott City resident. So that helps people out. It causes confusion sometimes in all of our relatives. Now, I'd like to thank all of you so very much. I'm so excited for 2021. Howard County Historical Society has done so much, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. It's amazing how much has changed since I first moved to the area in Annapolis and come here and visit. So Ellen, Giles, I want to thank you so very much. It's the first time I've ever met you. And I've met you a few times. Thank you very much for inviting me over. And I really look forward to both being here today. And I hope I can come back in the future because the history is so rich. There's only so much we can do for 45 minutes.
But we value our friends, so you may come back anytime.
Thank you so much. And you know what, I tossed a couple books over on the counter, so hopefully someone will give a donation and you can give them an autographed book from Vicki Bruce and myself. And that'll help a little bit more to the kitty to grow your wonderful organization.
That's a wonderful benefit. Thank you.
Thank you. Howard County has such a rich, rich, rich history. Now, what I'm going to do is go backwards just a little bit outside of Ellicott City to provide a little bit of background about the Oldfields before we move forward to my great-grandfather, who was John Frank Oldfield. We're going to start out, the Oldfield family actually arrived in the United States at around 1656 in Jamaica, Long Island, New York, Queens County. And at that time, they stayed in New York for just a very short period of time and almost immediately began to move south. Very soon, getting close to Philadelphia area. And then we'll jump forward to the William I told you about and the Hamilton and then John Frank. So William Oldfield resided in just over the border in Lancaster County in a little town called Little Britain, a township if you want to call it that. Very Quaker as well as Presbyterian, which were probably well known to all of you in this area up and down the 30 or 40 miles between here or 50 miles in Pennsylvania. There are many settlements, schools, that sort of thing in those two particular religious areas. So what William did, William was a very successful landowner, farmer, had a small boutique shops or businesses or manufacturing on his property. Very near his property were the Fultons. You're probably familiar with Robert Fulton, the inventor of the steamboat, the Claremont, that sort of thing. So William actually married two granddaughters of Robert Fulton. One of them had passed during childbirth and had a large number of 9 children. It seems to be a common practice. And so he married Martha Jane Fulton. He began with the Fultons doing quite a lot of business with Ellicott's mills. Grain milling, commerce, trade, that sort of thing. And it grew very quickly once the railroad came through, and this was the first stop on the B&O Railroad, that they began to do quite a bit of commerce. What happened next was very soon after, their son Hamilton, when he was 18 years or 19 years old in 1859, moved to Ellicott's Mills before it had changed its name to Ellicott City and got its charter. And was well received here because of the name had already been recognized in commerce, that sort of thing. And Hamilton almost immediately started a small mill with 2 partners, a small sawmill, and with help from his father, the money coming in from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and was able to establish himself quickly. And very soon after he started that sawmill with the partners, he met someone who you probably are familiar with, the family, the Zerlot family. And Wilhelmina Zerlot would be the woman he ended up marrying. Her mother and father were Austrian German descent. They were first immigrants here. They both were teaching music at the Patapsco Female Academy, which immediately gave them some prominence in the arts circuit, you know, the opera house, or that sort of thing. So there was a little bit of society going on. Hamilton really wasn't familiar with the societal type, you know, approach. Wilhelmina was very much involved in that because of the arts side involved with her parents. Now, Hamilton and Wilhelmina had 10 children, 9 who survived childbirth, and John Frank was my great-grandfather was the second child. He was born in 1867, to give you a general idea of the timeline we're now working with. And he actually, eventually, later in the 1890s, married Margaret Galena Fisher. I think the Fishers had a bakery, I think it was 127 Main Street, on the south side of Main Street. And I think we had what was formerly the drugstore, the house next door, and that would be approximately, I think, 128. Now, that house, I think, burned down in 1969, but the Fisher's house, which was the bakery, is still there on Main Street. The Oldfield's house has been rebuilt. And so it's not the original structure. I think the foundation is the only thing that was original. Now, what happened next is, over this period of time of having all these children, of course, Hamilton had to become quite a bit more industrious. It was becoming quite expensive. And I think we all smile that we would find out how expensive it is to have children, right? So he partnered up with some other men and again got assistance from his family in Lancaster for financing. And just up Frederick Road, which is just, or Frederick Avenue, I guess if you want to call it, before it splits, or just after it splits, if you stay on Frederick Road, on the right, even to this day, you will see an old house with a slate roof, which may have been recently replaced, and it sits back from the road, and it's all gravel and asphalt, that sort of thing now. But closer to the road, you'll see a white, I think it's painted, still painted white right now, vertical wood, almost a shack type barn at this point, or building. That was an iron foundry that he created, which became and in the Historical Society here, actually, there is one elbow pipe down in the basement somewhere, which I did see years ago. We haven't found it again. We will find it. It says H. Oldfield Pump Company on it. And interestingly enough, it became much more successful for the Oldfields to the point where John Frank, his brother William, his next brother Clarence, were all able to, by 15, 16 years old, all were working there. And it was supporting everybody. And if you look around town, you might occasionally find, at one point in the front of the Howard Hotel was a standpipe, which would be for the sewer lines, which were cast iron that were made in that foundry. And they used a little Tiber. This is something we couldn't even imagine doing today. The little Tiber was flowing underneath, or a little creek off of it was flowing underneath the actual foundry, and they had chambers there where they were dipping the red hot iron pipes and those sort of foundry items into the water, and the water just kept going down the hill to the Patapsco. You know, so can you imagine today what that would look like? I don't think that would go over too well. Now, so in 1883 is what we're going to jump to. This is when I think things really, really changed for the Oldfield family. It's when John was 16, John Frank, my great-grandfather. This is when both businesses really, really, really had taken off. And because of that, in that range of years, right after the Civil War and when Hamilton was starting to become more successful, he began getting involved from his father in Pennsylvania in the early abolitionist movement. And that came from the Quaker and the Presbyterian side of the family. And it was passed down into Hamilton, and Hamilton then began looking at the early Republican Party. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up, and I'm going to continue with some of this in the future, is politics became very, very, very much a business of the Oldfields in Ellicott City and Howard County, as well as their commercial businesses. So I really wanted to make sure I focus on some of that. It's quite interesting because it was a different style of politics than we have today. Yes, the patronage was there, but the fisticuffs are not there anymore. They yell and scream at each other and use social media, but back then they actually hit each other. And so there's some fun stories we're going to jump on quickly in a few minutes about some of that full contact politics is what I call it. And so now we've got Hamilton doing well, Wilhelmina doing well, her parents doing well, and a number of children running around town, getting involved with all sorts of different businesses, and then of course politics. So 1883, I'm going to go back again. That's really when things started to happen for Hamilton. When he got involved with the party, the early Republican Party, and because of donations to gentlemen that were running for governor or for state senate, that sort of thing, he began to get some attention to him regarding that. Now, also, just to jump back, Hamilton was a cursory member, if you want to call it this, of the Patapsco Guard as a quartermaster, because he understood business and that sort of thing. I don't think he ever got his fingers dirty though, I think there were only 100 members anyway, right? All right. So, but we did put it in the book because it's a cute little story. Because Wilhelmina Oldfield, whose name comes from Wilhelmina Zerlot, I think you figured that out, whom you all know from Howard County, and I did get to meet her a number of times, and it's so sad that we've lost her. But the Wilhelmina donated some items from the family to the museum, and two of those items were never identified until I showed up here, I think in 2003. And there's some epaulettes and a sword, and they belong to Hamilton. So I think he dressed himself up in wonderful regalia, even though he basically sat at a desk and pushed papers. But I guess you have to do that, right? You know, you have to look good. So because of all of his connections that he created in donating to politics, that sort of thing, in 1888, Hamilton was appointed the postmaster as a patronage position of Ellicott City. And there were two factions of the Republican Party. You probably recognize two names, McComas in Maryland history and Mudd. Of course, that goes all the way back to Dr. Mudd, yes. Those were the two factions in Maryland at the time who were fighting more amongst each other than they were the Democrats, I guess, because they just wanted, I think it was a power struggle, prestige, that sort of thing. And the Republican Party was very small in Maryland. So, of course, any position that you could get would make you feel important if you were a Republican. And so then, interestingly enough, with this McComas and the Oldfields back to McComas, that was Senator McComas, and another group of people, his name was Higginbotham, and from this area, he backed the Mudd faction. Now, Sidney Mudd was the Speaker of the House, state of Maryland at the time. And so these two Republican factions fought so much that John Frank, my great-grandfather, and his brother Clarence would regularly go door to door to actually ask for money for the party. And if it wasn't provided, they created an argument, try to pick a fight, because they were practicing for the fisticuffs that was coming in their own party. It was hysterical if you read some of the stories in my family lore. So what happened in 1892, let's move forward in politics again. The Republican Party truly split in Maryland between McComas and Mudd, or Oldfield and Higginbotham, if you want to look at it that way. And Hamilton lost his job as the postmaster because of it, because the Mudd people took control. John Frank had been working as a secure clerk, which was kind of a bonded position, actually very important in the Postal Service at the time around the country to be bonded. The Mudds were nice enough to let him continue with this job. And this was actually at 128 Main Street. It was in the first floor, the whole first floor of that drugstore now, or what was there, was the post office, not the old post office on top of the hill that we call the old post office. So this is the old post office, you know. And so he was able to maintain that, that job. John, we're going to focus mainly on John from now on, by the way, my great grandfather. Now, and he was so involved that finally in 1894, which was a year and a half, approximately a year and a half later, he won the Republican Central Committee chairmanship for the state of Maryland. And again, his rival was Frank Higginbotham, and they used to call it the two Franks, John Frank, who went by Frank, and Frank Higginbotham. And in the Baltimore Sun and other papers, you'd see the two Franks, it is the two Franks again, the two Franks this, the two Franks that, because they're always vying for power. Quite comical, I would say. So in 1895, Maryland had the Republican State Convention. Now, it was so contentious that they had to hold it at a church in Baltimore, and that was considered neutral turf. And one side of the outside of the church, outside the windows, were the Higginbotham men, and we're talking thugs. And on the other side of the church outside were the Oldfield men. And both of them were vying for power. Well, what ended up happening in this one, this is the greatest headline, I think, in some of the Baltimore newspaper history. One of them said, was it a blackjack? And that's the headline in the paper. And that's the leather blackjack with the lead shot in it, which you would pull out your pocket and smack somebody on the head with. And another headline later said, was it a knife? And then another one came up that said, hot times in Howard. Even though the headline about the fight. Now, I'll move to the fight for just a moment. Just so you know, this fight cost Hamilton and John Frank and Clarence $4,300 in 1895 to pay restitution, bail, and have the charges dropped by Frank Higginbotham. So what happened was Frank Higginbotham and John Frank were taking turns in the church at the lectern or in the pulpit, giving their speech as to why they should leave the Republican Party, that sort of thing. And somehow the word came out that you wife beater, you murderer, we don't know where they came from the audience, according to the media, the press at the time, causing John Frank to leap, as they said, he leapt from the pews, and he was apparently in the second row, so I don't know how he did it, but flew up and struck Higginbotham with one blow, knocking him out on the floor. And that's where the blackjack came out, because they said, how is it possible that this short in stature, small 5'6" tall man, 140 pounds when he's wet, knock out this very big, powerful man of Frank Higginbotham with a booming voice? Well, as you see, it was an interesting fisticuffs event. And by the way, that went on in Howard County quite a bit, not just the state of Maryland. There was a lot of contention, especially even James Melvin, who was very powerful in the Democrat Party at the time here and was also the publisher of the Ellicott City Democrat. There were even physical altercations in the Democrat Party. And I think that's a lot of fun that you don't see a lot of that reported on in Howard County and Maryland history. It was a very, very interesting style of politics. Other states, you hear about some of it, but not as much. Maryland seemed to have a special place in physical politics. So now I wanted to get to something here that all of you know quite a bit about. And Sean asked me to talk to you a little bit about the murder of Daniel Shea and his confessed murder, Jacob Henson. And Sean has done lectures on this, other people have, and he asked me to do a little bit on the Oldfield perspective from that and what we had from our own families, as well as the research that we did. By the way, the book that we did, Inspector Oldfield and the Black Hand Society, the reason I'm showing this right now, and it's available in both hard and paperback and Audible and digital and Kindle, everything else, go to Amazon or wherever you want. There's 2 chapters in there, chapter 2 and chapter 5. Chapter 2 we call Politics. That really covers a period of time in Ellicott City. We did a substantial amount of footnoting, a substantial amount of research on Jacob Henson, his father, the relationships, that sort of thing, and a number of other people, which may be very, very valuable to you in your enjoyment of history and also in learning and helping us learn as well, because I'm sure there's things you're going to be telling us, I hope, by the end of the day today. Well, so let's go to Daniel Shea's murder, Shea's Emporium, Shea's General Store. Jacob Henson was an employee of his for quite a while. And what happened was, we'll just make it very quick and simple. Henson's father worked for the Oldfields. They did odd jobs, painting, repairs, that sort of thing on a regular basis. And so the Oldfields were very familiar and knew Jacob very well as well. And in fact, even helped him sometimes with some tutoring, that sort of thing, because he was considered not too terribly intelligent, but he was very, very good normally and very industrious. And so the Oldfields were very supportive of the Hensons. And Jacob worked at Shea's General Store. Apparently, to make a long story short, Jacob had been drinking, goes back to the general store. He gets in an argument with his boss, Daniel. He ends up hitting him with a metal object, a blunt object, a number of times on the head. Daniel Shea, of course, passes. And the famous expression was that Daniel Shea's pocket watch fell out of his pocket and stopped exactly at 9 o'clock. And of course, Jacob took the pocket watch and took it with him. So immediately, John Frank and Clarence, William, the oldest brother, and Hamilton apparently stayed out of it as much as they could. I think because John Frank and Clarence were getting involved in politics, that maybe they saw the political end of this. They saw a great concern because on March 27th, 1895, Henson was tried almost instantaneously in the home of John O'Brien here in Ellicott City, and immediately sentenced to death by hanging on June 7th, 1895, coming up. So we have from March 27th to June 7th, this period of time, which was very, very contentious here in Ellicott City. And so the Oldfields pushed heavily to help pay for Henson's defense attorney, because the death penalty, as you know, was removed in Maryland in the 1860s. Then it came back, and the Oldfields were, as I think part of their background in the early Republican Party, it was the equality thing they were working on, equal opportunity, not equal outcome actually, but equal opportunities for everybody. And they had this mentality also that no one should be put to death, that kind of thing. And it's still passed, you know, you can still see some of those traditions passed through our family today. So the Oldfields pushed for a mental health screening for Jacob Henson to try to get him found mentally incompetent. Well, he ended up having 3 separate psychiatric evaluations, a couple of them paid for by the Oldfields. Every single psychiatrist, some people say they were contacted before they did the evaluation, you know, we never know. Every one of them decided that Jacob was not terribly intelligent, but he understood the difference between right and wrong, and he could stand trial. And so then the Oldfields went to Governor Brown at the time and begged Governor Brown for a commutation of some type, life in prison, whatever. And that didn't work at the time. So a gentleman by the name of James Melvin, who published the Ellicott City Democrat, he approached John Frank and Clarence, actually John Frank, sorry, not Clarence, and invited John Frank, because of the outcry of Daniel Shea being murdered and all his money apparently being missing, never recovered. He invited John Frank, we have some footnoting on this, to participate in going to the Ellicott City Jail and with a group of men and providing justice. What they meant by that was a lynching. John Frank openly spoke about this and said, I have denied that I would ever be involved in something like this. So he and Clarence decided on March 28, 1895, all the way through mid-April 1895, and William was brought into this as well. That's 3 Oldfield brothers. They took turns in 12-hour shifts guarding Jacob Henson in the Ellicott City Jail with their guns, because there was this huge uproar from the Whitecaps, they called themselves here in Howard County, to lynch Jacob Henson. Now, it didn't mean they all wore white caps or white robes or white kerchiefs, you know, handkerchiefs, whatever. It was just, it just depended on whoever they were. But they definitely wanted Jacob Henson gone. Unfortunately, what happened was that they did not succeed, as we all know. And Jacob was taken up the road and he was hung. But I'd like to read something from the book to see if you guys find this interesting about this case. And it really has during Black History Month, I think it really has some strong significance, and to see how divided we still were so long after the Civil War. And we would think that things were, and this is even after now, even after Reconstruction. But the night of March 28th, 1895, after the jury handed Henson the guilty verdict, Frank convinced Clarence and William to come with him to the jail. Pistols ready, they stood guard around the imposing granite structure in the freezing cold until sunrise. Night after night, for more than 2 weeks, they did this. Finally, with no sign of James Melvin and his colleagues and the anger in town dying down, Frank decided that Melvin would not be true to his word. Weeks went by and Henson remained unmolested in his cell, and Frank thought perhaps Melvin wasn't able to drum up enough support, as Henson was soon to hang. Well, he was wrong. Well, John Frank slept soundly on the night of May 27th. A group of men, some wearing hoods, others in long robes that hung over their heads down to their waists, and others with nothing more than a pocket handkerchief. They silently climbed the steep road to the jail, and it was just before midnight. Now, half of the men took positions around the jail. The other ones broke in using iron bars, that sort of thing. Now, the warden, incidentally, this is interesting, and his wife were not in town, but his daughter and her husband were here, and they were charged with watching the jail, which I think is kind of interesting, because if there was something this serious going on in this town, I'd be surprised if the warden and his wife would leave to go on a short vacation or go visit relatives or whatever. But anyway, let's get back to this. I'll jump to the next page in the book. And of course, after Jacob was hanged, there was a huge outcry in the state of Maryland. Governor Brown was furious. Now, by the way, he's a Democrat governor. Just want people to know that. This is not a party affiliated type thing. He was shocked. And the Whitecaps, the actual people that did the lynching, and of course, they weren't identified. This was a quote from them that they pinned on a card that hung from Jacob's body. "We respect our court and judges. Governor Brown forced the law-abiding citizens to carry out the verdict of the jury." Whitecaps. That's an actual, these are all footnoted, these are actual recorded facts. Now, when John Frank heard the news the next morning, he was furious, of course. He knew there'd be no arrest, no convictions. And the next day, the Ellicott City Justice of the Peace summoned a jury of inquest to look into the matter. But as in most lynching inquiries in most areas of the United States, unfortunately, the jury concluded that, quote, "No evidence has been obtained to justify any criminal indictments or prosecution." And again, this is footnoted as well. So I think there's some wonderful information from a very sad day or event in our book, that if you are looking for assistance in doing your own research, the back of our book is loaded with bibliography and footnote items that will be very helpful. So let's jump over to what happened with my great-grandfather after this interesting but sad period in Maryland and Ellicott City history. In 1896, this is actually another funny and sad situation. Sheriff Greenberry Johnson of Howard County was coming back from the Baltimore Orioles game on the trolley from Baltimore, had a little bit too much to drink, and fell off the trolley car on his way home and hit his head, eventually succumbing within the next few days to his head injury. Well, at this point, the Oldfield had financed Governor Lowndes, a Republican, to get elected, and he was now in place. Governor Brown was now gone. And because of that, Governor Lowndes gave a patronage favor, and he immediately appointed John Frank Oldfield to be the sheriff. At the same time, Hamilton was given his postmastership back. So it seemed like the governor was very happy with their support. And there's some interesting things that happened when Frank was sheriff, of course, but and his brother Clarence was appointed bailiff. And this was something, and so they proceeded to, may I just be candid, terrorize Howard County as a pair, because every debt that had to be collected, that sort of thing that they were sent out on, they were very, very assertive in the way and their style to collect money. that sort of thing. In fact, there's some interesting articles, again, in the book, from newspapers from the era as to their style of law enforcement. It seemed to go along with their style of politics, which included a few fists and a few black eyes. In fact, there's an article about John Frank sporting a large black eye around Ellicott City and being quite proud of it after he ran down a thief and also collected that money and returned it. And he thought that was sort of a badge of honor. I think that these are interesting characteristics of these gentlemen at the time. I guess, I don't know if they wanted attention, no idea, but it seems to me like they actually enjoyed this style of living, politics as well as law enforcement. So this was a period from 1896 to 1897. It was a fiery career as sheriff. He had this reputation as a tough fighter. Interestingly enough, the crime rate went down dramatically after a couple of his rough style arrests. Now, I'm not saying that was a good idea, but apparently it was quite effective. And now, but he wasn't well liked because of that style. So the new election in 1897, he immediately lost re-election. In fact, he got a very, very low percentage of the vote. So it tells you that people maybe were happy that the crime rate had gone down, but they certainly weren't happy with his style. And I think that might have been a good idea at the time because it was a bit rough. Now, he also ran for the clerk of county, the clerk of courts for Howard County as well, and lost that election as well. But that one's actually quite interesting. Great controversy involved. He was charged with election fraud, and it was basically going around Howard County with money and alcohol and visiting visiting people's house, and some of his sisters, the 9 children I'm talking about, and his older brother and his other brother. They were all actually going around the county. And by the way, this practice was not uncommon at all. But Melvin is the one that was still very upset. James Melvin was still extremely upset with John Frank for what happened with him trying to pin the lynching on those particular people, but of course it was never possible. So Melvin had it in for John Frank. And so there's a lot of speculation from the newspapers of the time that Melvin and some other people from the Democrat Party, because of that revenge, I guess, to try to destroy Oldfield's career and charge him or get him charged with election fraud. So of course we don't know, but he was exonerated of it through another inquest. It seems like he went through a number of those in his career, and had to pay some minor restitution or court costs, that kind of thing. But then it was over. Well, finally he started, I think, maturing. And in 1897, he married Margaret Galena Fisher. Now, this was the Fisher Bakery right next to the post office at 128, 129 Main Street. And I have a feeling he had an eye for her many times over the years when he worked in that post office, walking by the Fisher Bakery. And so they ended up getting married. And almost immediately after, or during this period of time, another racial controversy happens. And that is within a week of their marriage, the Oldfield family's very dear friend, the 45-year-old African-American man named Joseph America. He was their hostler, by the way, took care of all their horses and all their different family homes that they had around town, not just in one place, and all of their wagons, that sort of thing. And so he was very well known to the family. He'd worked for them for many years. Well, Joseph America was at an outdoor, sort of a bake sale, cake walk, type thing, that was partially outdoor and partially indoor. This is December, you know, and but they had some tables outside. So, and the men would go outside and smoke and maybe drink a little bit and then go back in. So there may have been a little bit of alcohol involved. Well, there was a gentleman by the name of Isaiah Nelson who had an affair and eventually stolen, if you want to use that expression, Joseph America's wife. So Joseph America had been very patient, but had it in for Isaiah. What happened was, as they got into it, there's still some question is that maybe they had a couple drinks out of their flasks before this happened. Well, Joseph America was a giant of a man, probably close to the 300-pound solid muscle, big man. he struck Isaiah Nelson a couple times and Isaiah died. So I think that was obvious that it was with his, apparently with his fist. So what happened is that John Frank and William and Clarence and even Hamilton at the time were absolutely distraught because they knew Joseph America. He was a peaceful, very, very quiet man. So obviously he had been pushed to his limit, is what they thought. That's their impression. That was our family story, that Joseph America was kind of pushed into it. And so the Oldfields were trying to get defense attorneys for Joseph to push for a self-defense defense at the time to keep him from being put to death, with the death penalty now renewed in in Maryland. So in 1898, unfortunately, on April 12th, Joseph was convicted. And the death penalty, the Oldfield said, okay, fine, what do we do next? Let's try to get him commuted to life in prison. Which, what happened was quite interesting, and Joseph America and John Frank, unfortunately, those letters were lost in the 1940s in Ohio, where we lived, in a flood near Ohio University in the Hocking River. We still had the letters between John Frank and Joseph America up until that time. While he was in prison until 1910. Yeah, he was in prison until 1910, and Oldfield stayed in touch with him, but he was able to get his release in 1910. So let's jump quickly to sort of the end of Oldfield's time in Ellicott City. We're running out of a little bit of time here. So in 1899, the U.S. Postmaster of the United States was James Gary. And James Gary had run for governorship in Maryland as a Republican. And again, that's why I'm showing the politics. The Oldfields had heavily supported Gary. So what happened is that Gary decides, well, I'm Postmaster of the United States now. And John Frank has been working in the Ellicott City Post Office, both when it was run by Oldfields and also run by another group. And I'm going to appoint him as a U.S. Post Office inspector. And this was a huge bonded appointment. Today, they go through full security clearance, that sort of thing. There's only 1,100 today, to give you an idea. They still have the largest jurisdiction of any federal law enforcement officer in the United States. And a lot of people are stunned when they hear that because you never hear anything about postal inspectors. It's because of our treaty with over 190 countries that includes their jurisdiction over that, anything that goes through the mail or through that process. So John Frank in 1899 was very excited about this. He immediately, though, happily, according to the Mudd faction of the Republican Party, is immediately shipped off to Chattanooga, Tennessee, to that facility. They thought, we're done with him now. This is fantastic. You know, the local Republicans said, it's over. He's still chairman of the Republican Central Committee then. Now, you're not supposed to have any political affiliation when you're in a position. At the time, the Postal Service said they were nonpartisan, and they still, of course, say that. But he never got rid of it. So what happened was, as Post Office Inspector number 156 since the beginning of the U.S. Post Office in 1775, when Postal Inspector number 1, Joseph Goddard, was chosen. So it shows you how few there were at the time. This is 1899. There's only been 156 in the history of the country. They have jurisdiction nationwide and internationally. They're paid $1,600 a year. They're expected to work a minimum of 50 hours a week, and they're on call 24 hours a day. And that was back then. So he's 32 years old. He's one of the youngest in the force, if you want to call it that. So what he does is he learns his investigative techniques. And in August of 1899, he gets a telegram from his brother Clarence from up here saying, was appointed a customs inspector in Baltimore again, for political patronage, which was a very, very, very nice job. I think he was being paid $1,900 a year, which was great money back then. I mean, look at it today. Add 2 zeros to that. That's about what it would be today. To give you an idea of, that's $190,000 a year would be a nice income. Yeah. And Frank is actually still chair of the Republican Party at this time. So on August 9th, 1899, he leaves Chattanooga against the wishes of his inspector in charge and the U.S. Postmaster and the inspector in charge, William Cochran. He comes here to Ellicott City, and goes to the convention, if you want to call it that, the state convention. And immediately he is recalled by the postmaster and by William Cochran, the chief inspector, warning him upon the ruination of his career. Well, Higginbotham again comes up, he's involved, and the Mudd faction is involved in getting the governor of Maryland and the postmaster, that they had contacted them to write these letters and immediately get Oldfield dragged back out of Ellicott City and taken back to Howard, or down to Chattanooga. Well, he gets down to Chattanooga on August 13th, 1899. They've gotten him out of trouble. Clarence, by the way, does not win the Central Committee position, but he's allowed to stay on the committee. Oldfield gets down there and he's immediately dismissed. He is the one and only U.S. Post Office inspector in the history of the United States in 1775 to have been fired from office. And it says, if you look at his original personnel record, it says removed. Well, he comes back home, spends 2 years with Clarence doing all kinds of crazy Republican politics stuff, right? In 1901, interestingly enough, he's given a reprieve. He is asked to come back because he actually was a very good inspector. He had done solved some really, really interesting cases down when he was in the Chattanooga district in that region of the country. Some large corruption cases and fraud cases, that sort of thing. And they were very happy with him. So he was brought back. So he's the only post office inspector again in history that where they drew a line through the remove on his original record at the U.S. Archives, and it says reinstated. Well, I think the punishment was fun. They reinstated him at $1,200 a year, so a $400 loss in pay. And let's just quickly wrap up for so you can go to Q&A. In 1902, he gets his first nationally famous attention. He's honored by Teddy Roosevelt and the chief inspector, the postmaster, because he solves this amazing case. He's actually asked to go. He's actually been shipped to Ohio, but he was asked to be an impartial investigator. So they shipped him to the state of New York. And there was a huge corruption scandal going on between congressmen, the assistant district attorney, his brother, who was the postmaster, and all the way up to the secretary or to the postmaster of the United States. Teddy Roosevelt wanted this fixed. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in fraud. So Oldfield successfully, with Inspector Little, investigates the case up there, and they successfully get over 55 indictments across the East Coast and throughout the Postal Service and other contractors and congressmen. A number of people go to jail, but quite a few slip out from underneath the radar. I don't know how that happens, but it seems to happen today where a few of them get caught and the other ones somehow don't get the indictments, even though they were all together. But it happened back then as well. The thing that makes this case fun was that there's a famous article in the New York Times in 1902, where Ernest Baldwin, the assistant district attorney of New York City, is in the courthouse. Oldfield's temporary office with Inspector Little is also down the hall in the office. Well, Baldwin's one of the people they're investigating, and his brother, who is the postmaster of New York. So Oldfield confronts him. The newspaper article is great, by the way. He confronts him. He calls him out. He calls him out for a fight because Baldwin says, "You're insulting me, and I'm going to, libel and slander and whatnot." Oldfield knows, I've got all the actually, he said the receipts. That was a term back then, I guess, that you've got the evidence. I've got the receipts on you, Baldwin. I'm going to get you. He says it right out in the hall in front of everybody, calls him out. Well, Baldwin kind of, they get separated in the hallway. They end up downstairs at lunchtime, an hour or so later. And the newspaper calls it an angry embrace, rolling around in an angry embrace on the floor of the courthouse steps of the New York City courthouse, which they said it was in pugilistic style, which would be the bare knuckle, fists up with the derbies and the mustaches. Can you see that of that time? With their waxed mustaches going at each other, one with red hair, one with brown hair. And Baldwin was much taller than Frank. They said that Frank got in a few good licks, but Baldwin definitely got the better, as the New York Times says. Well, eventually, of course, Baldwin, it all comes to truth a little bit later in late 1902 and 1903 that Oldfield was right. Now, from his career from then on, from 1903 to 1916, upon his death, he was a post office inspector, quite famous, nationally famous, for the first interstate international mafia organized crime indictment and conviction in U.S. history, which is, they call themselves the Black Hand. The book has a large section in it about that. That's probably what he's most famous for. And then finally, when he resigns from the Postal Service because he gets so famous, newspapers in England, newspapers in France, newspapers all over the world, which we have a huge collection of all those that his wife, Margaret Galena, kindly cut out and kept, and many of the other inspectors around the world mailed them to him, cut them out of newspapers in foreign countries and sent them to him. He saw a great opportunity in 1911 when Hamilton died to resign from the Postal Service, which he did, and also sort of separate from Ellicott City completely by being the executor of the will. Wilhelmina Oldfield's father, Walter, was the second to the youngest brother. John Frank bequeathed as part of the executorship the pump foundry and the partnership in the sawmill, all the houses and property, that sort of thing, to basically William, and some to Clarence, and some to Walter. And that's why Wilhelmina, when she donated all her tools from her father Walter to the museum here, it's a chest with a lot of the tools we use in the foundry. Those were actually Hamilton's tools, and then Walter's tools, and now they're the Historical Society's tools. But unfortunately, the house burned down that had in 1969, so a lot of those things have been lost. But I thought you might be interested in finding out what happened to one piece of the 9 children, and give you a great background on some of the, mainly on the men. My apologies for that, but there's not a lot of information on the sisters, except for one, and that was Ida. And when Hamilton was not able to be the postmaster, she was actually appointed the postmaster of Ellicott City. She was the second female postmaster in the United States history. So I thought that might be kind of interesting. And her sister Sadie, or Sarah, also served for a very short stint, but it's not registered in the U.S. Postal Service. I think it may have been a substitution or something like that, but she technically would be number 3. You know. So thank you so much, and let Sean.
Well, we have a couple of questions, so I thought I would pull out a couple of questions that we've had so far. One question is from John Mueller, and I'm familiar with John. And John's asked this question before. So he's asking about the white caps as a description. So the white caps, I understand the white caps were actually kind of a nickname for what the real group was called. They were called the kerchiefs, or? Well,
actually they were. If you actually look at letters that they wrote, or messages that they wrote, and usually they were cryptic, and I don't really know some of the reasons. I don't have a lot of research on the white caps, but the white caps is what they called themselves, but they didn't always have white caps or white robes. A lot of times they just had a bandana, but it was always white, or a kerchief, a handkerchief. And when, for example, with the Jacob Henson's situation, the note that they put a tag on him and left it hanging there with him hanging, and it was a message to Governor Brown that that they were afraid that justice would not be served. In other words, that Jacob may not be hung on June 7th because there was a lot of pressure in the state of Maryland to commute his sentence and give him life in prison, just like Joseph Americas was. And there was a really wonderful, this state was so wonderful, and it still is today. There was an outpouring of love to the African-American community. And even though there was still that strife that didn't really get developed and matured and made into more of an equality side, it took all the way to what, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. But Maryland was really, really open armed. There just was a small few that still had I don't know, had a bone to pick. Who knows what it was, but I'm sure, as we all know, they've come around too, and they're all gone now, right? Wow. They're all gone now. But there aren't many left. I mean, there aren't many people that have that kind of attitude. I'm glad to know that. Yes. I've lived here for 20 years, almost 20 years now. And I've really found how Annapolis and Maryland, how it embraces people from all over the world. And I think that's wonderful. I mean, it's such a diverse state.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm. Second question from board member Rita Hamlin. Is Hamilton Street off of Main Street named for Hamilton Oldfield?
We've been asked that. We don't know. There's also an Oldfield court. There's, this is something all of you can help us with. There were 9 surviving children from Hamilton. John Frank was only the second child. We don't have any problem with William. He was the first child, and he moved very soon after John Frank became a postal inspector. He moved to New Orleans. The family continued through there. But we aren't really sure about some of these Oldfield pieces of history. So if any of you know a descendant from the Oldfields, or if any of you are a descendant of the Oldfields, feel free to contact us and the Historical Society, and maybe they can forward it to Sean, and they can forward it to us. There's so much more to learn, and there were so many other families that they were integrated with, throughout the history of Ellicott City and Howard County, and even this region in Maryland. And I don't have any idea if people are still involved in the Republican Party or not, but at that period of time, it was a lot of fun to talk about, I think, if you go back, right? Yep. What was it, about 1859 to about 1899. Just hysterical fisticuffs, and just an interesting period of history. Yeah,
we had, for those of you who did who came to our admin meeting a few years ago, we looked at a similar era of politics that was equally as raucous, and that would be the Federalist Era, and the Hensons, who had some tie back to Howard County, and then we had a speaker a few years ago from Massachusetts. Actually, he was a congressman from Massachusetts, wrote this wonderful book, and he kind of tied back the political fervor of the right around the War of 1812 and compared it to today. That we even had fake news back then.
Absolutely, of course.
So, right.
Now the Hensons, if I remember, there were 20 of them in Howard County that signed up with the militia or the guard in the Civil War.
That's right. The Hensons,
I mean, can you imagine 20 men and boys of one family joining one group? Talk about, if I was a wife or a daughter or a sister, I would not allow that to happen. Can you imagine losing every one of them? Now you might, we're not going to go into the details. You might have a few arguments with them now and then, but you don't want to lose all of them, right?
Right.
But can you imagine the Hensons? They were a raucous group, apparently. I don't think the Oldfields can compare to the Hensons.
There are a few, and I think that's one of the things as we try to uncover some of this untold history, the stuff that's buried in our archives, and finding these stories. I will say, this period of time we've covered today, our volunteers, we've tried to piece together that Reconstruction era in Howard County. It's difficult.
It's very difficult. It's raucous. And of course, don't fear going back to the Baltimore newspapers. It's amazing how because of that darn trolley going back and forth, and Ellicott City's fame for a place where you could have some fun at the time, as well as Baltimore, the reporters seem to enjoy going back and forth and sitting in the pubs and bars and that sort of thing. They picked up a lot of information. I think that's where they got a lot of their material for the newspaper. And so during that Reconstruction period, you can find out quite a lot by looking in the old Baltimore newspapers about Ellicott City, funny enough. Isn't that interesting? Because of that trolley, look what happened to Greenberg. Goes to a baseball game, has a few too many, and comes back on the trolley and knocks his noggin in 1896, right? So I'm sure there was a lot of interesting Reconstruction era stuff. It seems like it began to calm down, though, if you notice, after about the 1898, 1899, it started to become more of what we see today. I think there's more collegiality, a little more decorum. There's still a bit of yelling and screaming, which, that's noise, as I call it. When it comes down to the meat and potatoes, they meet, they reconcile, they get things done, they get things passed. Back then, I think it was a little bit rougher.
You mean we're not meeting on Main Street with our fists up?
Well, no, at least it's more words and social media and what they call it, blasting tweets, But I don't see any, I see a lot of desk warriors or keyboard warriors, and I think that's actually better because it lets them vent. Back then, you could get hurt.
Yes, it's true. And I will say, I know there are quite a few researchers and partners and colleagues who've tuned in today. If anyone's interested in more information during this time period, I know that William's done a lot of work and Victoria's done a lot of work on the politics of this era. So if you have any questions and you're trying to get in touch with them, certainly send an email. And obviously, we we want to help any way we can with all the various research projects that are out there.
I sure there's a million of them going on. And by the way, the reason that the politics is so involved, and we did a chapter on it, is because the more research I did, the more I found out, my gosh, politics was a business for this family, for my relatives. And besides their other businesses, and I was just stunned at how much they were involved in it. And because our family, it's not been a tradition after that.
Although once again, and I'm sure
no one's been elected or appointed position ever since that era.
but if you say the name Oldfield, and I think if we have some 60 some members who are still on here, at least half of you, when you hear the name Oldfield, probably think Howard County Public Schools.
But think of Wilhelmina, of course.
Wilhelmina,
Yeah.
of course.
Well, Wilhelmina, I think, she's part of the kinder, gentler version of the Oldfields. Okay, it came from Walter, who was the second to the youngest son. Just for a little bit of fun here, the last son was born in 1884. That would be when Hamilton was 44. That's really amazing, a 44-year-old father. That wasn't common back then. He's the only one I ever got to meet, and his name was Ulysses S. Grant Oldfield. And he died in 1978 when I was 16. I got to meet him one time in my life. And, it was just, and I'll just say that he was considered highly eccentric and highly intelligent, but we were just told that it was great to meet him and that was it, But Walter was very industrious, the next youngest, and that was Wilhelmina's father. And he did well for a time with both mills, and then had some financial trouble later on from those mills. I don't really know much about that. Wilhelmina had that written down in a diary, which I think went to some of her other relatives, which we never really got a chance to get the details on exactly what happened. But Wilhelmina was such a success as a teacher and as a superintendent of schools. She was loved by everybody. She was loved by the students, which is crazy. It's not, teachers get a lot of grief from students, and it's great to see that the students loved her as well as the city. And I'm so happy that she was able to contribute some of the things from the old house that burned down, and get a few of those things to the Historical Society. I plan on making sure that some of the things that we have will eventually end up here as well.
Well, we've got one last, and this is
there's a question.
this is a great question to end on. Carol Hess would like to know, where can people buy your book?
Well, that was very sweet, Carol. Thank you very much. The book is in about 7 or 8 formats. It originally came out in August of 2018 as a hardback, and which is still available. The last bits of the original printing are still available on most bookstores, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, that type of thing. There is a paperback version that is still in print that came out in 2019. So if you go to Amazon and you just type in Inspector Oldfield in the search bar, and all the different formats. And there's large print for those of you that don't, that are vain like I am and don't want to be seen wearing your reading glasses.
Well, I think that concludes our virtual annual meeting. Once again, thank you, everyone. These things are kind of tough sometimes to put together. Originally, we had planned on live streaming this, but there was a couple of little snafus there. What we're going to do is we're going to edit this into 2 separate sections. So we'll have the beginning meeting will be its own video, and the second part will be, the lecture part will be its own video, and it will live on our YouTube page, and I'm sure we'll share it across our social media pages and add it to our website as we continue to improve all of our digital formats.
Sure, as they grow, right?
As they grow.
I'd like to thank everybody. I hope you learned something from me, and I'm very, very desirous of you contacting me so I can learn from you, especially about Howard County. This is such a core group of people here in Howard County. It would be like me bringing together a professional research team, because all of you, as hobbyists or as lay historians or as professional historians, the stories coming from the outside are many times much more valuable than the ones that we find doing deep research. And so please continue, enjoying your history. It teaches you about the past, present, and what the future may hold, and how to react to it and plan for it. So please continue teaching history to your students, to your guests, and stay excited about history. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.